Geoffrey Barone is immortal. On television screens around the world, the boy will forever remain 5 years old, smiling, safe, and loved. But Sawyer Sweeten is gone. On April 23rd, 2015, these two timelines, the eternal sitcom childhood and the brutal reality of adulthood, collided on a quiet porch in Texas. While the world laughed at a rerun, a 19-year-old boy was packing his bags for a vacation that would become a farewell. The film doesn't end with fake laughter. It ends with a silence that Hollywood never prepared him for. The mid-90s sitcom was a machine built to sell comfort, not art. When casting the Barone twins for Everybody Loves Raymond, producers weren't looking for actors. They wanted prop children, biological scenery designed to humanize the adult leads. These toddlers were treated less as people and more as atmosphere with a heartbeat. Yet, a darker intuition predated the fame. Elizabeth Guinea, their mother, lived with a chilling premonition that she was on borrowed time with her sons. Sawyer Sweeten wasn't just born into a role, he was born into a countdown. His life was a loan from fate, waiting to be violently reclaimed. Sawyer and his identical twin brother Sullivan were the perfect candidates, not because of their personality, but because of their genetic redundancy. The industry relies heavily on twins for a very pragmatic, almost cold-blooded reason: labor laws. California's strict child labor regulations limit the number of minutes a toddler can be under hot studio lights or in front of a camera. By hiring twins, a production effectively doubles its efficiency. When one child becomes fussy, tired, or simply acts like a child, they are swapped out for their genetic copy. The camera never blinks and the audience never knows the difference. From the very moment of his hiring, Sawyer's identity was already being diluted. He was not an individual. He was one half of a whole, a spare part in a multi-million-dollar engine. He was interchangeable. This is a profound psychological imprint to place on a developing mind. The idea that your presence is conditional, and if you fail to perform, there is another version of you waiting in the wings to take your place. The environment in which Sawyer spent his formative years was a masterclass in artificial reality. A sitcom set is a strange, disorienting place. It looks like a home. There is a couch, a kitchen, a staircase, but nothing works. The fridge is warm, the food is often plastic or painted, and the staircase leads to nowhere. The fourth wall is missing, replaced by a gaping darkness where cameras, boom mics, and a live studio audience reside. For a child developing their cognitive understanding of the world, this environment is their baseline for reality. Most children learn social cues from the playground or the dinner table. Sawyer learned them from a script. He learned that if he did something cute, 300 strangers sitting in the darkness would laugh and clap. He learned that affection was often blocked, lit, and rehearsed. There is a neurological cost to this kind of upbringing. The human brain, specifically the dopamine reward system, develops rapidly during early childhood. Consider the neurological implications of this on a 16-month-old brain that has not yet developed object permanence. The understanding that things exist even when they cannot be seen. For Sawyer, his reality was a fragmented cycle of broken attachment. Dozens of times a day, he was handed from his mother to a handler, placed under blinding lights, commanded to smile, and then returned to the shadows when the scene was cut. This repetitive rupture in attachment theory taught his developing brain a dangerous lesson. Love is transactional, and safety is conditional on performance. When a child performs a task and receives praise, the brain releases dopamine, reinforcing the behavior. For Sawyer, this reward loop was hijacked by the artificial grandeur of celebrity. Normal developmental milestones were replaced by production milestones. Learning to walk was not just a personal victory, it was a plot point. Losing a tooth was not a private rite of passage, it was an episode hook. The private self was cannibalized by the public persona. By the time he was 5 years old, the line between Sawyer Sweeten and Geoffrey Barone had become dangerously porous. The boy on the screen was always happy, always safe, and always surrounded by a loving, resolving family. The boy off the screen was beginning to understand that he was an employee. Sawyer was growing up in a synthesized benevolence. He was surrounded by adults who performed love for a living. He watched Patricia Heaton perform the role of a stressed but loving mother, and then he watched her switch off when the scene ended. He watched Ray Romano play the bumbling but devoted father, only to retreat to his trailer to deal with the massive pressures of a billion-dollar franchise. For a developing mind, this creates a terrifying precedent. Emotional expression is a utility. It teaches the child that warmth is something to be turned on when the red light glows and extinguished when the check clears. This is not merely confusion. It is a foundational fracture in how a human being understands intimacy. If the parents you see every day can fake love so perfectly, how can you trust the love of anyone else? The Raymond set was not a torture chamber, but it was a laboratory where Sawyer's capacity for genuine connection was slowly, invisibly irradiated by the glare of professional pretense. Psychologists refer to the result of this upbringing as identity foreclosure. It is the state where an individual's identity is defined and cemented by external forces before they have the cognitive capacity to explore who they actually are. Sawyer didn't just play Geoffrey Barone, he was colonized by him. His personhood was confiscated at the age of 16 months, leaving him with a script instead of a soul. Stripping away the glamour reveals the daily existence of a child star in this era. It was a life of profound isolation masquerading as adoration. While other children were learning to socialize in the chaotic, organic environment of a kindergarten classroom, Sawyer was kept in a bubble. His interactions were managed by handlers, agents, and on-set tutors. The adults around him were not just authority figures. They were colleagues who depended on his compliance for their livelihood. If Sawyer had a bad day, the production halted and money was lost. This creates a subtle but crushing pressure on a child to be good, not in the moral sense, but in the industrial sense. Be quiet, be still, smile when the red light goes on. Do not be a burden. This conditioning, the suppression of negative emotion for the sake of the collective good, would sow the seeds for the smiling depression that would later claim his life. He was trained to be a vessel for other people's joy, even if it meant hollowing out his own. Within this context, the specific trauma of the twin mirror began to fester. Identical twins often struggle with individuation, the process of forming a distinct identity separate from their sibling. For Sawyer and Sullivan, this natural struggle was exacerbated by the industry. They were dressed alike, styled alike, and treated as a single unit, the twins. They were rarely addressed by their individual names by the crew, often referred to collectively. This forced indistinguishability stunted their ability to answer the fundamental question of adolescence: who am I? If Sawyer looked in the mirror, he saw Sullivan. If he looked at the call sheet, he saw Twin A or Twin B. The world did not want them to be different. The world wanted the symmetry, the novelty. They were viewed as a set, indistinguishable and decorative, like salt and pepper shakers on a dining table, valuable only when paired and useless when separated. As they grew from toddlers into young boys on camera, this lack of individual agency began to calcify. They were not developing separate interests or separate circles of friends. They were locked together in a professional embrace that neither had chosen. This professional embrace bred a specific unspoken toxicity known among child psychologists as the spare heir syndrome, but adapted for Hollywood twins. In the royal lineage, one child is the heir, the other is the spare. In the Sweeten duality, both were the spare. They were constantly auditioning for the right to be themselves in any given scene. Imagine the subtle psychological violence of a director looking at Sawyer, finding a flaw, a loose tooth, a tired eye, a slight mispronunciation, and immediately swapping him for Sullivan. It reinforces a brutal existential lesson. You are not unique, you are replaceable. Most human beings derive their self-worth from their singularity, the idea that there is only one of me. Sawyer was denied this basic human conceit. He was a component part, interchangeable with his brother to the point where their own mother admitted that, on screen, even she sometimes couldn't tell them apart. This erosion of the self creates a vacuum where a personality should be. Instead of developing distinct hobbies or traits, the twins often mirrored each other to maintain their marketability. To be different was to be unemployed. So they curated a sameness that would eventually become a prison. When the industry was done with them, they were left with a shared identity that was too small for two growing men, yet neither knew how to carve out a separate space without feeling like they were betraying the other. They were Siamese twins, joined not by flesh, but by a contract. The show Everybody Loves Raymond was a colossus. It was consistently in the top 10 ratings, generating billions of dollars in revenue over its lifespan. The cast, Ray Romano, Patricia Heaton, Brad Garrett, were becoming titans of the industry. But in the background, the children were merely aging. The writers of the show, brilliant as they were at dissecting adult relationships and marriage dynamics, often struggled with what to do with the children as they grew older. Geoffrey and Michael Barone were not the focus of the show. They were accessories to the adult dysfunction. As Sawyer grew from a toddler into a preteen, his screen time did not significantly increase, nor did his character's depth. He remained a background player in his own life. This reinforces a devastating message. You are necessary for the aesthetic, but irrelevant to the narrative. You are there to be looked at, not heard. By the time the early 2000s rolled around, the cute toddlers were becoming gangly boys. The industry has a cruel term for this, the expiration date. There is a specific window of time where a child is universally appealing. Once puberty hits, the biology of the child betrays the fantasy of the audience. Voices crack, limbs get long and awkward, and the aw shucks innocence evaporates. Sawyer had entered the uncanny valley of the child star. He was too old to be the cute baby, but too inexperienced and untrained to be a serious dramatic actor. He had hit the cuteness expiration date, and the industry that had once fought over him now looked at him with the cold indifference of a consumer discarding a product that had spoiled. For a child whose entire sense of self-worth has been predicated on being the cute twin, the onset of puberty is not just a biological change, it is a professional crisis. Sawyer was growing up on camera and millions of people were watching the transformation with a critical eye. The internet was in its infancy, but fan forums were already active, and the commentary on child stars was rarely kind. He was being scrutinized before he even understood what scrutiny was. Behind the scenes, the mechanics of his financial future were being laid out in complex trust funds and blocked accounts, governed by the Coogan Law. In theory, this law protects child actors from predatory parents, ensuring that 15% of their earnings are set aside until adulthood. In practice, it creates a pot of gold narrative. Sawyer was told implicitly and explicitly that he was rich, that he was set for life, that all the hours under the hot lights, all the missed play dates, all the unnatural compliance would be worth it because at age 18, he would be free and wealthy. This created a false horizon. He wasn't working toward a career, he was waiting for a payout. It instilled a passivity in his ambition. Why study hard? Why develop other skills? Why grind in the real world when you are a prince in waiting? But the reality of Hollywood accounting is murky, and the lifestyle of a star's family often bleeds. The accounts dry before the child ever sees the ledger. The promise of future security became a sedative, keeping him from developing the survival skills he would desperately need when the applause finally stopped. As the show approached its final seasons, the atmosphere on set began to change. The ending of a long-running sitcom is like the slow death of a small town. People begin to pack up, the adults talk about their next projects, their movies, their spin-offs. Ray Romano was going to be a stand-up legend. Patricia Heaton had other shows lined up. But for Sawyer, there was no next project. There was only the looming void. The family that he had spent his entire conscious life with, the only stability he had ever known outside of his biological relatives, was preparing to disband. For a child, this is akin to a divorce. The people who hugged you every week, who bought you birthday presents, who told you they loved you, were essentially firing you. It wasn't personal. It was business. But try explaining business to a heart that has grown up believing the lie. The final taping of Everybody Loves Raymond in 2005 was viewed by 32 million people. But for Sawyer, the end of the show was not a graduation. It was an eviction. He was about to be pushed out of the only world he understood. Following the wrap party, the Barone kitchen, the room where he had spent half his waking life, was dismantled into plywood scraps, and the family moved from the intense focus of Los Angeles to the sprawling anonymity of Riverside, California. This geographical shift was a shock to the system, akin to a deep-sea diver surfacing too quickly. He had the bends. In Riverside, Sawyer and Sullivan were enrolled in public school. This is where the cruel reality of the prop child legacy began to manifest in social interactions. High school is a brutal ecosystem for any child, fueled by hierarchy and the desperate need to conform. But Sawyer entered this arena with a target on his back. He was famous, but he wasn't cool famous. He wasn't a rock star or an action hero. He was the cute kid from a sitcom that everyone's parents watched. To his peers, he was a relic. The fame that had defined him became a barrier to genuine connection. How do you make a friend when every introduction is tainted by recognition? Every time a classmate looked at him, they didn't see Sawyer. They saw Geoffrey Barone. They quoted his lines back to him. They asked about Ray Romano. They projected their own relationship with the television character onto the flesh and blood boy standing in front of them. This creates a profound sense of alienation. He was visible to everyone, yet seen by no one. He was trapped in a hall of mirrors where every reflection was distorted by his past. This isolation was compounded by the presence of his brother, Sullivan. This twin mirror phenomenon is critical to understanding Sawyer's descent. In a normal sibling relationship, there is room for divergence. One brother might be the athlete, the other the artist. They carve out separate niches, but Sawyer and Sullivan had been professionalized as a unit. They were the twins. The industry had commoditized their sameness, and now, in the vacuum of their post-stardom life, that sameness became a cage. When Sawyer looked at Sullivan, he saw a living, breathing reminder of his own stalled trajectory. They were mirror images, not just in genetics, but in circumstance. If Sullivan was struggling to make friends, it validated Sawyer's own social awkwardness. If Sullivan was feeling directionless, it confirmed Sawyer's own lack of purpose. They created a feedback loop of despair, a closed circuit where negative emotions bounced back and forth, amplifying with each reflection. They were arguably the only two people on Earth who understood exactly what the other was going through, which sounds like a comfort, but in reality it can be a curse. There was no outside perspective to pull them out of the gloom. There was only the echo of the other twins' sadness. During these teenage years, the phone stopped ringing. This is the brutal economics of the expiration date. Hollywood has an insatiable appetite for novelty, and by 2008, the Sweeten twins were no longer novel. They were teenage boys, awkward, gangly, and navigating puberty. The industry had no use for them. They went from being courted by agents to being ghosted by them. They attended auditions, but the room had changed. They were no longer the only twins in town. They were competing against trained actors, kids who had spent their childhoods in drama classes rather than on a sitcom set. Sawyer and Sullivan had worked for 9 years, but they hadn't necessarily learned the craft of acting in the way a classically trained actor does. They had learned to be Geoffrey and Michael. When asked to be someone else, a villain, a romantic lead, a gritty drama character, they floundered. The rejection was relentless. Imagine the psychological toll of being told repeatedly that you are no longer wanted by the very industry that raised you. It's not just professional failure. It feels like a parental abandonment. The industry that had applauded their every move for a decade now looked at them with cold indifference. They were too sitcom, too specific, or simply not cute anymore. Sawyer retreated. The exuberant, smiling boy from the red carpets began to withdraw into himself. The silence that follows fame is not just quiet, it is deafening. For a decade, Sawyer's nervous system had been calibrated to the high frequency of validation. The applause of the studio audience, the flash bulbs of the red carpet, the dopamine rush of recognition. When that input suddenly stops, the withdrawal is physiological. It is known as the phantom limb of fame. The person still feels the itch of celebrity, the expectation of deference, but there is nothing there to scratch. This transition is particularly savage for child stars because they have no normal baseline to return to. A banker who loses his job remembers what it was like to be a student. Sawyer only remembered being a star. He was cast out of Olympus and forced to walk among mortals who viewed him as a curiosity rather than a peer. The phone didn't just stop ringing, it became a symbol of his obsolescence. Every silent day was a confirmation that he had been discarded. The industry doesn't send a termination letter, it simply looks away. And for a young man whose entire world was built on being looked at, this aversion of the public gaze felt like a slow erasure of his existence. He wasn't just unemployed. In his mind, he was ceasing to be real. He developed a protective shell of irony and humor. He was the funny one, the dry wit. He used humor to deflect the pain, a classic defense mechanism. But beneath the jokes, a deep-seated resentment was taking root. He began to internalize the failure. He didn't blame the system, he blamed himself. He must have thought, if I were better, if I were more talented, they would still want me. This is the toxic fallacy of the child star. They assume their success was due to their inherent worth, so their failure must be due to their inherent lack of worth. They fail to see that they were simply products riding a wave of market demand. When the market shifted, they were left stranded on the shore. It was during this period that the financial reality began to blur. The pot of gold narrative was still strong in his mind. He believed he had a safety net. He believed that the residuals from Everybody Loves Raymond, which was airing constantly in syndication, would sustain him forever. This belief was a narcotic. It numbed his ambition and blinded him to reality. Why study for a geometry test or learn a trade when you are sedated by the fantasy of endless wealth? This false security arrested his development, leaving him waiting for a payout that would never be enough to save him. It kills ambition. Why grind in entry-level jobs or study for a degree when you believe you are set for life? This false sense of security arrested his development. While his peers were learning the grit of the real world, Sawyer was waiting. He was suspended in a state of suspended adolescence, waiting for the check that would solve everything. But the checks, while substantial, were finite. And the cost of living in California, the cost of maintaining a lifestyle that felt appropriate for a star, was burning through the reserves. He was driving a nice car. He bought a house in Riverside with Sullivan, but he didn't have the income stream to support the assets. He was asset-rich on paper and cash-poor. He was living the lifestyle of a retiree at the age of 18, without the life experience to manage it. The house in Riverside became a fortress. It was a bachelor pad for two young men who were hiding from the world. Inside the walls, they could still be the Sweeten twins. Outside, they were just two guys who used to be on TV. The disconnect between their private reality and their public perception widened into a chasm. Neighbors would see them and think, well, those lucky kids. They didn't see the aimlessness. They didn't see the days spent playing video games because there was nothing else to do. They didn't see the creeping paralysis of depression. Depression in men, particularly young men, often doesn't look like sadness. It looks like boredom. It looks like irritability. It looks like withdrawal. Sawyer wasn't necessarily crying in his room. He was just checking out. He was numbing himself to the slow passage of time. He was watching his life slip away, day by unremarkable day, waiting for a second act that was never going to come. As the years ticked by, the residual checks started to shrink. Syndication deals get renegotiated, audiences fragment, and the payouts decrease. The financial pressure began to mount. We know from later reports that there were crushing debts and overwhelming financial liabilities. The golden handcuffs were tightening. Imagine the panic setting in. You are 19 years old. You have no college degree. You have no job experience. Your resume lists one job that ended a decade ago, and now the government says you owe them money you don't have. The shame of this is cataclysmic. For a young man raised to be the provider, the man of the house in his own mind, financial failure is equated with emasculation. He couldn't ask for help because that would mean admitting the dream was over. That would mean shattering the illusion that he was a success story. So he kept it inside. He smiled. He joked. He maintained the facade of the happy-go-lucky sitcom star even as the walls were closing in. He began to talk about alternative careers. He mentioned wanting to be a veterinarian. It was a noble thought, a pivot toward something gentle, something involving animals who wouldn't judge him for his past. But becoming a veterinarian requires years of rigorous academic study. It requires discipline, focus, and a grind that Sawyer had never been prepared for. He had been trained to memorize lines, not to study organic chemistry. The gap between the dream and the execution was too wide. Every time he looked at the mountain he had to climb to reinvent himself, he felt the weight of his own inertia. It was easier to stay on the couch. It was easier to stay in the past. It was easier to be Geoffrey Barone than to do the hard, terrifying work of becoming Sawyer Sweeten. The tragedy of the identity foreclosure is that it steals your future by anchoring you to your past. Sawyer couldn't move forward because he was dragging the corpse of his childhood fame behind him. It was a heavy, rotting weight that made every step exhausting. And the world wouldn't let him cut the cord. Every time he went to the grocery store, every time he filled up his gas tank, someone would recognize him. "Hey, aren't you?" And in that moment, he would have to perform. He would have to put on the mask. He would have to validate their nostalgia at the expense of his own reality. He was an artifact on display, a living museum exhibit that was slowly gathering dust. The psychological toll of being a public commodity is that you never truly belong to yourself. You belong to the audience. And when the audience is done with you, they don't set you free. They just leave you on the shelf. By early 2015, the cracks were becoming invisible fissures. To the outside observer, nothing was wrong. However, the collapse was not a slow erosion. It was a sudden vertical drop. In the final retrospection, the family would identify a terrifyingly specific window, the 8-day spiral. Sawyer didn't just become sad, he became unrecognizable. The charming young man began to physically deteriorate before their eyes, looking disheveled and unplugged, as if the vital cord connecting his soul to his body had been severed. He wandered the halls of his own home like a transient, his eyes engaging with a reality no one else could see. Most hauntingly, he began to exhibit a compulsive physical tic. He would constantly rub his head, digging his fingers into his temples as if trying to physically massage away a chaotic noise inside his skull, or perhaps trying to claw out thoughts that were no longer his own. In a moment of terrifying clarity amidst the fog of his breakdown, Sawyer turned to his mother and delivered an indictment that should be carved onto the gates of every Hollywood studio. California makes you think things that aren't true. This was not a complaint about the weather. It was a realization that his entire reality, the fame, the money, the persona, had been a hallucination induced by his environment. But the delusion ran deeper. By the time he reached Texas, the depression had metastasized into paranoia. He didn't just feel worthless, he felt malignant. He confessed to his mother that he believed he was evil, that his existence was a stain on the world. The angel of the sitcom had been warped by his own mind into a monster. He wasn't planning suicide to end his pain. In his broken logic, he was planning an execution to protect the world from the evil he believed he had become. This was not boredom. This was the physical manifestation of a psyche fracturing under pressure. The trip to Texas was approaching. It was meant to be a vacation. But for a mind on the brink, a change of scenery doesn't offer relief. It only offers a new backdrop for the same old pain. He packed his bags. He packed his smile. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of his despair, he began to pack his exit strategy. The stage was set for the final act, and this time, there would be no laugh track to soften the blow. While his social identity was eroding in the silent suburbs, another crisis was silently brewing, one that would strip away his last remaining defense. The isolation was painful, but the realization that his perceived safety net was actually a trap would prove to be the breaking point. The world thought he was a prince, but he was rapidly becoming a pauper in a gilded cage. The trip to Texas was intended to be a restorative break, a chance to escape the smog and scrutiny of Southern California, to breathe air that didn't taste of industry and ozone. There is a harrowing phenomenon often observed in the final days of suicide victims: the lift. It is a period of sudden, unexplained calm or even happiness that occurs once the decision to die has been made. The ambivalence is gone. The struggle is over. A plan is in place. Family members in Texas reported that in the days leading up to the Thursday morning, Sawyer seemed present. He joked, he smiled, he engaged in the banter of a family reunion. To the untrained eye, this looked like recovery. To the retrospective eye, it was the final flawless performance of a lifelong actor. He was giving his family one last season of the good Sawyer, the version of himself they wanted to see. This masking is the cruelest aspect of the tragedy because it disarms those who might otherwise intervene. His aunt and uncle didn't hide the guns because they didn't see a monster. They saw their nephew. They saw the boy who loved video games and laughed at dinner. They didn't realize that this levity was not the sunshine of hope, but the sunset before the eternal dark. He was saying goodbye in a language only he understood, gifting them a memory of joy to hold on to when the horror began. But geography is rarely a cure for the geography of the mind. When you travel, you take your demons with you, packed neatly alongside your clothes. In the silence of the countryside, the contrast between the simple, grounded lives of his relatives and his own internal chaos became agonizingly sharp. The quiet did not soothe him. It amplified the noise in his head. He was surrounded by people who loved him, who laughed and shared meals with him, yet he had likely never felt more alone. He was a satellite orbiting their warmth, unable to enter the atmosphere without burning up. On the morning of Thursday, April 23rd, the air in Austin was heavy with the humid promise of spring. The house was waking up. Inside there was the bustle of family, aunts, uncles, cousins, the chaotic warm hum of a home that is lived in, the smell of coffee, the sound of morning television, the casual conversations of a Thursday. It was a symphony of normalcy. Sawyer was there, but he wasn't there. He was existing in a parallel dimension of despair, separated from the living by a pane of glass that had been thickening for years. We must look closely at the timeline of that morning. There were no dramatic arguments reported. There was no sudden outburst of rage. This suggests a chilling resolve. The decision had likely been made days, perhaps weeks in advance. It was not a reaction to a momentary trigger. It was the execution of a plan. He walked through the house, perhaps looking at the faces of his family with the detached sorrow of a ghost. He was saying goodbye without saying a word, moving through the rooms like a phantom before he had even died. He stepped out onto the front porch. We must pause here and dissect the profound symbolism of this location. In the study of suicidology, the psychological autopsy often looks at the where as much as the why. The front porch is a threshold space. It is neither fully inside nor fully outside. It is the boundary between the private sanctuary of the family and the public judgment of the world. It is a liminal zone, a place of transition. The cruelty of the geography cannot be overstated. Sawyer did not flee to a hotel room to spare his family the discovery, nor did he go to a desolate field to disappear into the earth. He walked out onto the balcony while the house hummed with life just feet away. Most heartbreakingly, his twin brother Sullivan, his other half, his genetic mirror, was reportedly just rooms away. The proximity was horrific. By choosing this specific moment and location, Sawyer ensured that the person closest to him in life would be the first to confront his death. It severed the twin bond in the most violent way possible, leaving Sullivan not just as a survivor, but as a witness to the immediate, shattering aftermath. The bullet that ended Sawyer's life shattered the timeline of the brother standing just a few walls away, condemning Sullivan to a lifetime of wondering why the bond that they shared since the womb wasn't strong enough to signal the goodbye. By choosing this specific spot, Sawyer was positioning himself on the edge of two worlds, belonging to neither. He did not retreat to a bedroom, which would have been an intimate, enclosed violation of the home's interior safety. He did not go deep into the woods or drive to a remote location, which would have signaled a desire to disappear completely and anonymously. He chose the porch. He chose proximity. This choice speaks to a devastating conflict within his psyche. On one hand, the location ensured that he would be found immediately. It was a cry for recognition, a final desperate assertion of his presence. He wanted his pain to be visible. He wanted the world to stop looking at Geoffrey Barone and finally see the shattered young man lying on the wood. It was an act of unmasking, but on the other hand, it was an act of subconscious aggression. To end one's life mere feet away from innocent family members is to inflict a permanent trauma upon them. It is a transfer of agony. He was taking the chaos inside his head and externalizing it onto the physical world of those he loved. It ensures that the family can never walk through that door again without reliving the moment. It stains the sanctuary. This is not to say Sawyer acted with malice. Rather, it illustrates the blinding, distorting power of his pain. In that moment, his suffering was so immense that it eclipsed his empathy. The need to stop the noise in his head overrode the protective instinct he had for his family. The weapon was a handgun. This, too, is a critical detail in understanding the masculine nature of his exit. In the United States, firearms are the most common method of suicide for young men. It is a method that allows for no hesitation, no second thoughts, and no rescue. It is definitive. It speaks to a desire for immediate cessation. There is no waiting for pills to work, no window for regret. It is a violent, thunderous punctuation mark. For a boy who had spent his life being passive, moved around sets, told what to say, directed by others, managed by agents, this was perhaps the only moment of absolute, terrifying agency he ever exercised. He held the power of life and death in his hand, and for the first time, he was the director. He called cut. The sound of the gunshot shattered the morning calm. It was a sound that would divide the Sweeten family's history into before and after. Inside the house, the confusion would have turned to horror in seconds. The rush to the porch, the discovery, the screams. In that instant, the sitcom life was obliterated by the visceral, bloody reality of death. There was no laugh track. There was no commercial break. There was no rewinding the tape. The boy who had been immortalized on celluloid as a symbol of innocence lay dead, a victim of the very pressures that had turned his childhood into a commodity. In the immediate aftermath, the news cycle began to churn. The machinery of celebrity culture, which had ignored Sawyer for a decade, suddenly roared back to life. Everybody Loves Raymond star commits suicide. The headlines were splashed across TMZ, CNN, and the tabloids. The world was shocked. He was so young, they said. He was so rich, they assumed. He had everything to live for. They lied. The public narrative immediately tried to fit his death into a recognizable tragedy trope. Was it drugs? No. Was it a girl? No. The truth that it was the slow, crushing accumulation of identity loss, financial shame, and existential emptiness was too complex, too uncomfortable for a soundbite. The media wanted a scandal. What they got was a sorrow so deep it defied easy categorization. Meanwhile, in Riverside in Texas, the family was left to pick up the pieces of a reality that no longer made sense. Sullivan, the other half of the twin mirror, was now staring into a broken glass. His reflection was gone. The person who had shared his womb, his face, his career, and his life was erased. The survivor's guilt in a twin dynamic is catastrophic. Why him and not me? Could I have stopped it? Am I next? Sullivan wasn't just losing a brother, he was losing a part of his own self-definition. The we became an I, and the I was lonely and terrified. The feedback loop was broken, leaving only silence on the other end of the line. The tragedy of the porch is that it was preventable, yet inevitable. we must pause to acknowledge the singular hell reserved for Sullivan Sweeten. In the literature of grief, there is a specific category for this loss, the twinless twin. Research suggests that the loss of a twin is ranked as more psychologically devastating than the loss of a spouse or a parent. It is felt as a physical amputation. For Sullivan, Sawyer was not just a brother, he was the only other person on the planet who possessed the encryption key to their shared reality. They had navigated the surreal landscape of Hollywood together, two astronauts tethered in the void. When Sawyer pulled the trigger, he didn't just end his own life, he obliterated the archive of their shared existence. Sullivan was left as the sole keeper of memories that no one else could verify. Every inside joke, every glance on set, every silent understanding they had shared was now half erased. The survivor is often left with a crushing burden of why? Why did the darkness take him and not me? We shared the same DNA, the same environment, the same pressures. Was I just lucky? Or is the same fuse burning inside me, waiting to reach the powder? This existential terror is the toxic inheritance of the suicide survivor, a shadow that Sullivan would have to learn to walk with for the rest of his life. It was the culmination of a system that builds children into skyscrapers, of fame on foundations of sand. When the winds of adulthood blew, the structure could not hold. Sawyer Sweeten died because he had been taught how to be a character but never how to be a person. He died because the gap between who he was and who the world wanted him to be had become a canyon he could no longer bridge. As the police tape was wrapped around the porch in Texas, the reruns continued to play on televisions around the world. A 5-year-old Sawyer smiled, frozen in time, blissfully unaware that his future self was lying cold on a porch in Texas, a casualty of the very dream he was acting out. When the physical evidence of the tragedy was cleared away, a new, more insidious form of haunting began. This was not a haunting of creaking floorboards or cold spots. It was a haunting of signals and frequencies. We must now confront the concept of the rerun torture, a unique psychological torment reserved for the families of deceased child stars. In the digital age, nothing truly disappears. Content is immortal. And for the Sweeten family, their grief was not allowed the privacy of silence. It was constantly interrupted by the broadcast of a ghost. Everybody Loves Raymond is not just a television show. It is a global institution. It is syndicated in over 100 countries. At any given hour of the day, somewhere on this planet, the show is airing. This means that at any given hour, Sawyer Sweeten is alive. He is 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, eating cereal. He is 7 years old, playing in the backyard. He is 10 years old, delivering a punchline with perfect timing. For the casual viewer, this is comfort viewing. For the grieving mother, father, and siblings, it is an ambush. Imagine the sheer emotional violence of walking into a dentist's waiting room, an airport lounge, or a friend's house, and seeing the face of your dead son or brother, vibrant and laughing, staring back at you from a screen. It is a jarring collision of timelines, the eternal happy past crashing into the devastated present. For Sullivan, the surviving twin, this ubiquity must be particularly excruciating. He cannot escape his brother's face because he wears it. But beyond the mirror, the screen serves as a relentless reminder of what they were and, more painfully, what they were supposed to be. The show freezes them in a state of perpetual innocence. It preserves the lie that everything is okay. It preserves the Geoffrey Barone persona that arguably contributed to the suffocation of Sawyer Sweeten. The character is immortal, but the boy is dust. This disconnect creates a cognitive dissonance that complicates the grieving process. How do you mourn someone who is still alive in the cultural consciousness? How do you let go when the world refuses to turn the page? The Rerun torture extends beyond the family to the public perception of the tragedy. Because audiences see the young, cute Geoffrey on their screens daily, they struggle to reconcile that image with the 19-year-old man who took his own life. The public grief is often shallow and misplaced. They mourn the character, not the person. They post R.I.P. Geoffrey on social media, using screenshots from the show. This commodifies the death. It turns a deeply personal tragedy into a pop culture moment. It strips Sawyer of his adult identity even in death, forcing him back into the box of the sitcom kid for eternity. He is denied the dignity of his struggle. He is remembered only for the performance that hid it. Furthermore, we must address the systemic silence that followed the shock. Hollywood is adept at mourning its legends, the Robin Williamses, the Philip Seymour Hoffmans. There are tributes, montages, and speeches. But when a prop child dies, the industry's reaction is often muted, awkward, and brief. There were statements of condolence from Ray Romano and Patricia Heaton, undoubtedly sincere, but there was no industry-wide reckoning. There were no town halls about the mental health of child actors. There were no changes to the labor laws or the Coogan Act to include mandatory psychological counseling for transitioning stars. The machine stuttered for a moment, and then it kept humming. The show stayed on the air. The checks kept clearing. The next generation of twins was already being cast in the next hit sitcom. This lack of systemic change is the ultimate insult. It suggests that Sawyer's death was an anomaly, a glitch, rather than a predictable outcome of a high-risk environment. It ignores the pattern. We have seen this before with Anissa Jones, Family Affair, with Dana Plato, Different Strokes, with Jonathan Brandis, Sequest, DSV. The list of child stars who succumb to addiction, depression, or suicide is statistically alarming. Yet the narrative remains focused on individual demons rather than occupational hazards. By framing Sawyer's death as a personal failure rather than a systemic one, the industry absolves itself of responsibility. It washes its hands of the blood and continues to recruit. In the months following the suicide, the tabloids moved on. The clickbait cycle found new tragedies to exploit. But in Riverside, the silence deepened. The house that Sawyer and Sullivan bought, the symbol of their independence, became a mausoleum of broken dreams. The debt didn't disappear with Sawyer's death. It became part of his estate, a final bureaucratic cruelty for the family to untangle. The golden handcuffs were removed only to reveal the scars they had left on the wrists of the survivors. Sullivan withdrew further. His sister Madeline, who also played their sister on the show, became a vocal advocate for mental health, trying to wring some meaning out of the senselessness. She spoke of the pressure, the isolation, the feeling of being adrift. Her voice was brave, but it was shouting into a hurricane of indifference. The ghost in the machine is not just the digital image of Sawyer, it is the lingering question of what if. What if the industry treated children as apprentices rather than products? What if there was a discharge program for child stars, similar to how soldiers are reintegrated into civilian life? What if someone had told Sawyer explicitly and repeatedly, "You are more than your IMDb page"? What if he had been allowed to be ugly, to be angry, to be imperfect, without the fear of being replaced by a duplicate? These questions haunt the legacy of Everybody Loves Raymond. The laughter on the track now has a hollow metallic ring to it. It sounds less like joy and more like the grinding gears of a factory that consumes youth and spits out residuals. This void was made palpably visible days later. The funeral of a young person is always an offense, but the funeral of a child star carries a specific, grotesque weight. It is a collision of two irreconcilable worlds: the private, raw devastation of a grieving family and the public, curated performativity of the entertainment industry. When Sawyer Sweeten was laid to rest, the mourners were not just saying goodbye to a 19-year-old boy who loved video games and motorcycles. They were burying a cultural artifact. They were burying Geoffrey Barone. The eulogies spoken were undoubtedly filled with love and confusion, attempting to bridge the gap between the smiling child the world knew and the tormented young man who had died on a porch in Texas. But as the dirt fell, it covered more than a coffin. It covered the evidence of a systemic failure that had begun nearly 2 decades prior. We have spent this narrative dissecting the how and the why, the identity foreclosure, the twin mirror, the financial traps, the depression. Now, in the final analysis, we must confront the what now. We must look at the wreckage left behind and ask what this tragedy tells us about the cost of our entertainment. Sawyer Sweeten's death was the statistical inevitability of an industry that treats fame as a toxic substance. The burden of this reality now falls on Sullivan, the surviving twin who must navigate the wreckage of the twin mirror alone, forever wearing the face of his dead brother. In the end, on that Texas porch, the gunshot was a desperate reclamation of agency. It was the only way Sawyer knew how to stop the show, turn off the lights, and silence the laugh track. The boy who belonged to everybody finally took himself back, leaving us with the absolute silence we refused to grant him in life,